Now from Little Rock, member of the Select Committee on Intelligence and the Armed Services Committee, Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas.
New dad.
New dad.
Tom Cotton, new dad.
Oh, that's nice.
And also a man that they are crediting with birthing Mr. McMaster's position at the NSC. So tell us about General McMaster. You go back a long way with him. And I was just starting to tell the story about when he got passed over for a promotion, you took it quite personally.
Yeah, Joe, I want to commend the president for picking General McMaster as a national security advisor. It reflects great credit on him, as does his entire national security cabinet. General McMaster has been a legendary officer in the Army for 20 years. He fought one of the decisive battles in the Gulf War. He was kind of one of the very first commanders in the Second Iraq War to bring counterinsurgency into the fight almost 2 years before the surge in 2007. He's an unorthodox thinker. He's never marched to the beat of the Army drum, so to speak. In 2006 and 2007, General McMaster was passed over for a promotion from colonel to 1-star. And I and many other lieutenants and captains at the time were very discouraged by that. I actually submitted my resignation papers in part because of the way the Army had treated General McMaster. Now, ultimately, I withdrew those and had the opportunity to deploy to Afghanistan. But Bob Gates recognized just what a great leader General McMaster was, and he actually recalled David Petraeus from Iraq in the middle of the war to sit on a promotion panel that ultimately gave General McMaster his first star.
Are you at all concerned about what's happening at State or what's not happening there, with jobs being filled and Rex Tillerson seeming to be a little bit out of the loop?
No, Mika, we're still very early in the process. We have a lot of positions left to fill in the Senate. The pace there has been very slow, but whether it's state or defense or homeland security, we do need to move on to filling in the sub-cabinet. Again, the president has created one of the probably best national security cabinets in modern times, and I look forward to seeing these sub-cabinet nominations coming forward and hopefully moving more quickly in the Senate on them than we've been able to move on the cabinet positions.
Senator Cotton, it's Willie Geist. Good to see you this morning. We just showed pictures of the foreign policy cabinet you've been talking about. Mattis was in there, Generals Mattis, Kelly, now McMaster, also Rex Tillerson. Many people think, I would say most people think, that Donald Trump respects generals, he respects CEOs, and will defer to these men on foreign policy. So as you look at this team, are you able to identify a Trump doctrine on foreign policy? What do all those picks mean?
Well, I think the president clearly does respect generals, as do I, as do most Americans. And the generals that he's put in this cabinet, men like Jim Mattis and John Kelly, now H.R. McMaster, they were colonels when the war started. So the lives that we lost in the war were not just names on a division personnel roster to them. They were the young soldiers with whom they trained in the same gym and ate in the same dining hall. They knew these men, and they know that the highest priority is the preservation of peace and the avoidance of war through being prepared for war. I think Donald Trump appreciates that, and he wants to make America tough and strong and respected in the world again, not so we can win wars, but precisely so we can avoid them.
So this makes us less likely, you think, Senator, to commit troops to places like Syria, for example?
Well, any military officer who's seen the face of war is always going to be reluctant to commit troops cavalierly and without a core national security interest at stake. But at the same time, they recognize that we have to protect our country and protect those core national security interests. What I think General McMaster's appointment will ensure is that every cabinet secretary and the expertise and the experience of the dedicated public servants they represent will be fully aired, and the president will have all the information he needs to make to get to the right decision for our country.
Senator, last week we failed to take enough note of the fact that General Hal Moore died. General Moore led the airborne into the Ia Drang Valley in November of 1965, the first battle in the war in Vietnam that spelled out what that war was going to be all about. General McMaster, with his PhD thesis that became a best-selling book, Dereliction of Duty, sort of spoke truth to power about what went wrong in that war. General Moore was one of his principal objectives in terms of Hal Moore speaking out against the body count and the way the war was going. And McMaster's role in speaking truth to power has continued throughout his career. Do you think there is any potential point of conflict between General McMaster at the National Security Council, because of who he is and what he stands for, coming up against people like Steve Bannon and perhaps even the President of the United States?
Well, I have no doubt there'll be disagreements within the National Security Cabinet, Mike. That's always the case. What General McMaster's role as the National Security Advisor is, and kind of in keeping with the best people who have served in that role as an honest broker like Brent Scowcroft or Stephen Hadley, is to try to resolve those disagreements when they can be resolved at a level below the President. But if they cannot be, to frame those disagreements and make the President well informed with all the expertise that our national security professionals bring, so the President can make the right decision. You're right, though, to cite H.R. McMaster's famous book, Dereliction of Duty. It was required reading for junior officers when I was in the Army. I suspect it still is. And it makes the point that the generals and the national security policy-making process failed during the Vietnam War because they didn't give candid advice and push back strongly enough from White House micromanagement. You know, the National Security Council is a coordinating body. It's not a policy-making body. And as Bob Gates has said, when they try to get into operational details, it's usually incompetent, as we saw in the last administration in Afghanistan, or it's illegal, as we saw in Iran-Contra under President Reagan. I think General McMaster appreciates that, and President Trump chose him in part for that insight and for those experiences that he's had.
Senator, if I could ask you about health care, I know you and other Republicans are thinking about the transition away from the Affordable Care Act, but you're concerned about your constituents during a transition period. Can you talk about ways Arkansans have benefited from the Affordable Care Act and why you're concerned about the transition?
Well, obviously, we don't want to have the same kind of abrupt problems that occurred when Obamacare was implemented in full in 2013. So whatever the timing is for repealing Obamacare and then replacing it with a new health care reform approach, we need to have a gradual transition into the that next phase. So there'll probably be a phase-in of 1 to 2 years at least. I want to make sure every Arkansan has access to affordable and quality personalized health care. That was the promise of Obamacare, but Obamacare made a lot of the problems in our healthcare system worse. It didn't deliver on that promise.
How do you rate the president's first month in the White House? We've been sort of knocking around here, obviously been very, very critical of him over the past month on several counts, for being disorganized, for being undisciplined with his communications, especially on Twitter. And yet we look at his foreign policy team, and it's almost like a tale of two administrations. I'm wondering how you sort through all that to try to get an overview of how this administration's done over the first month.
Well, Joe, on the things that matter and the things that are going to last, President Trump is off to a good start. Neil Gorsuch, I believe, is an accomplished jurist who will have a distinguished legacy once he's confirmed to the Supreme Court. The President's National Security Cabinet, as we've discussed, is one of the best in modern times. He's taken the action he can take so far to fulfill some of his campaign promises, like starting a wall on our southern border. Ultimately, though, presidencies are going to be largely defined by legislative action in the way that Roosevelt was defined by the Social Security Act, in the way that LBJ was defined by the Civil Rights and Voting Acts and Medicare, Ronald Reagan by his tax legislation, his defense buildup. So we're going to have to deliver over the next year, over the next 4 years, with major legislation to reform our healthcare system, to reform our tax code, to build up our military, for President Trump to deliver on all the promises that he made during the campaign.
All right, Senator Tom Cotton, thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you for strongly encouraging the White House to make the selection they did. It makes a big difference. A lot of people breathing a sigh of relief this morning.
Thank you all. Good to be on with you.
Take care. This morning, there